Muchas veces confundimos racismo con discriminación y se nos olvida que el racismo tiene este componente no solo de la historicidad y el origen colonial de esta problemática, sino también que es estructural, ¿no? No solo es un acto de discriminación aislado. Entonces, bueno, yo tengo tantas cosas que decir en tan poco tiempo que hice mis notas en inglés, so I'm gonna switch to English so I can have this note
As you prefer.
correctly read. So yes, well, for example, what can be done? These kind of fora are very important for discussing and putting things on the table, no? Because these kind of platforms, fora, remind and constantly and actively remind countries, member states, stakeholders, and the audience, no, to develop and implement data systems and gathering information correctly at all times. No, for instance, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which I am the part of the group of experts, establishes that the combat against racism should be based in research. No, again, talking about data. Either qualitative or quantitative. So, for example, self-identification, which now is put in place, for example, in Mexico for indigenous and Afro-Mexican populations, becomes fundamental, no? And another tool for measuring. It also, these kind of platforms invite member states, private sector, and academia to develop and improve their measuring efforts. All of this to monitor and design better public policy to combat racism. Also, these spaces and platforms not only focuses on promoting data systems, but also to have a critical reflection, which is very necessary, on how to measure and discuss which ethnic or racial categories could be adopted according to the different contexts. For example, in India, it could be very useful to use the category caste to measure the dynamics of inequality within the Indian society, right? But for example, in Latin America, the category brown, prieto, or marron could be relevant, no, to understand how opportunities, rights, and jobs are limited for darker skinned people. Now, because resources are important, but what can countries do when they don't have the resources, no, and can measure ethnic or racial categories? There are also other proxy variables that they can use. For example, considering much qualitative research in the Latin American region, in 2010, the project Pigmentocracies from Princeton University was created and introduced as a new methodology using the color palette, confirming what we already know. And we have discussed this for these past days. Darker skinned people, regardless of their ethnicity, suffer from racism, educational and economic inequality, racial profiling, and human rights violations. That's why qualitative research can be another option. No, if countries cannot find or cannot develop quantitative indicators. First, because qualitative research puts the experiences of racialized communities at the center of the discussion. And secondly, because they contribute to the design of brand new and innovative indicators, no, that could be complementary or even more revealing than the traditional racial and ethnic categories. Since then, for example, countries like Mexico have adopted this methodology in many of its national surveys. So yes, these platforms like the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination of UNESCO gather experts, member states, private sector, and civil society in order to reflect on these very same topics to get what? Inspiration of best practices, of measuring, for example, and the most efficient policies to combat racism and discrimination.